In our Learning to Advocate for Children and Families series. Excited to have you with us today. And as we begin, please share in the chat who you are and where you're from. Over 1,000 people have registered from all over today, and we're really excited to have you with us. Our colleague, Kat McDonald, founder of Linchpin Strategies, will be hosting today's session. And our colleague today, Maria Jose Gutierrez, will be simultaneously translating our webinar into Spanish. Thank you, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls, then select Spanish. And to mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. We also have closed captions available for those who would like to use them. To turn captioning on, click on the closed caption icon in your Zoom controls and select Show Subtitle, the size of which you can adjust. If you are having trouble hearing the webinar, just check your audio settings in Zoom, and you can also call into today's session by selecting phone audio settings and following the instructions. Please use the chat feature for comments and questions. Whether they are technical or if you would like to ask Kat anything. Complete our feedback survey to receive a certificate of attendance, either when it opens at the end of the webinar or via the link that'll be in the email you'll receive with the recording of today's session. The survey and the webinar recording will be available in both English and Spanish. And the recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. All of the recordings of this series, as well as a lot of our other free programming, are also available on our YouTube channel. And we also have a digital badge that you can use on your social media. There it is. You can access it through the QR code that you see here, or download it after completing the feedback survey. And we also have a reference guide available. You may access it through the QR code here. And it will also be available after completing the feedback survey. And then finally, before we begin, I want to thank my colleagues for their production and technical support. And now I'd like to introduce Kat McDonald, who has been hosting this series, and we're so grateful for her and her knowledge sharing. She's the president of Linchpin Strategies, where since its founding, she's led successful efforts to establish new medical research funds, protect small business opportunities, and secure increases of more than $4 billion for early childhood education. She has worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. She has staffed domestic, social issues, and appropriations for Congressman Steny Hoyer. And she has served as the legislative director for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, the ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee. Kat, thank you so much once again for joining us and for facilitating today's session. And we're so glad to have you and everyone with us.
Michael, thank you so very much. And somebody is going to help me come on video. Thank you, Michael, for your introduction, and thank you to the Touchpoints team, Isabella and Maria Jose. So grateful for all of your help in preparing for today's session. If you have been with us for the first two webinars, welcome back. And if you are joining us for the first time, we're delighted that you are here. In our first webinar, we talked about using stories to engage your elected officials and matching messengers and messages to your audience to add power to the advocacy that you are launching. In our second webinar, we talked about accelerator organizations and how to find them so that they can help you amplify your message. And we also talked about gerrymandering and the impact that that has on all of the issues that all of us care about. Today, we are going to do a deep dive into how you create and implement an advocacy plan. And once again, we're going to use a real life example to walk through how this can be done. Before we dive in, I need to do something that I have never done before. I need to share with you that I am being treated as follow-up for breast cancer. And while the cancer is going to be okay, the drugs have side effects. And one of those side effects for me is brain fog. The way that the brain fog shows up is sometimes when I am looking for a word, I get the wrong word, something that starts with the same first letter, but is not the word that I'm looking for. And when that happens, I get upset and stressed. And the more stressed I am, the more frequently it happens. So I am asking for your patience with me and your grace. And I'm hoping that by sharing this with you at the beginning of the presentation, when I make a mistake, it won't be so stressful and I won't make as many. So let's get started and we'll see how this goes today. So we're going to talk about an advocacy plan and organizing. And on the next slide, we'll start with a kind of a long list of elements of an advocacy plan. We're going to walk through each of these, and it looks like a lot. Don't be overwhelmed. And remember, we will make the slides available to everybody, so you don't need to worry about remembering this or writing it all down. So an advocacy plan really starts with the creation of a core leadership group. You want to bring together a group of people who have time and passion and can really do the work that is needed to drive your issue and your advocacy forward. They don't have to do all the work themselves, but they need to be the ones who are driving the train. You want to become educated about the issue. You know, I used to work for a congresswoman who said that in order to be given equal credibility with the men that she worked with, she had to be twice as smart and know 3 times as much as the men did. When I am launching an advocacy plan, my job or my goal is to be twice as strategic and know 3 times as much about the issue as the folks on the other side. Then you need to understand who is affected by this issue, not just the people who might be hurt, but also the people who benefit. And what is it that they are getting out of this, and how strongly might they organize on the other side? If you don't already know, it's important to investigate who is in charge of making the decisions. Who do you need to influence in order to address the issue that you care about? And what constraints do they have? Is there a limit to their power and influence? Do they need to pay attention to budgets? Is this an issue of money? We talked about on the last episode, we talked about $10 million that was raised by fines. And part of the job of the advocates was needing to find a replacement source of funding. What arguments are the other side going to use in support of what they're doing, and why things are the way they are that you are trying to change? What is the timeline for making decisions? Does a decision need to be made when the state legislature is in session? Does a decision need to be made in time for the governor's budget to be submitted? What constraints, what external constraints might there be? Are there any public meetings or forums or opportunities to testify? Then maybe some of those are planned, but maybe some of those are required. Sometimes when there are government processes in place, there are requirements for public meetings. And who are the organizations, the other organizations besides your group that might care about this and might help? So as we go to the next slide, because this is a long list, but we're not done, I would like to say thank you for all the lovely expressions of support in the chat. I appreciate it very, very much. So you need to put together some materials that are going to get information out to, maybe it's the elected officials, maybe it's others in the community. And if you can have a catchy slogan or a logo, sometimes that helps unify people, get attention, and convey your message. I remember when I was working in Congress and we were trying to prevent cuts to the school lunch and school breakfast program, members of Congress started wearing Save the Children ties and scarves to work in the Capitol building every day. And those Save the Children ties and scarves became a unifying force for the people who opposed those cuts. Use social media to get the word out, but don't forget about traditional media, including radio and local television stations and local newspapers that might be looking for good issues to write about. If it's appropriate, you might need to submit a FOIA request to get information. So a FOIA request is a request that is submitted to a government, and it is asking for the release of documents or information that haven't been released publicly, but that could be and that would help you. As you learn more about the issue, you might need to do more research. You know, it's sort of counterintuitive. It seems like maybe it doesn't make sense, but sometimes as you learn more about an issue, you uncover more issues that are related, more rabbit holes that you can go down, more areas to learn more about. Organize community education events. But community education events often attract people who already know a little bit about this and care about it. So are there other events that you can show up and piggyback on to provide information to people? Maybe you can have a sign outside the local grocery store. Maybe you can have a sign outside a local PTA meeting. Think about other events, places where people go, and how you might be able to use somebody else's event to help get the word out about your issue. Meeting with decision makers. So as you have done all of this organizing and all of this preparation, then you want to marshal your arguments and meet with decision makers to present your case. If there are public hearings, you want to organize speakers to testify. If there are real problems, real reasons why something is in place, you might need to be proposing workable, realistic, alternative solutions. And hopefully, at the end of all of this, you will win. It seems like a lot. It can be a lot. That's why you want a group of people who are working together. So if you're like me, it's a lot easier to understand things, abstract ideas, when they are applied in real life. And so we're going to take this advocacy plan that I just outlined, and we're going to apply it to a real case study, one that happened in my own neighborhood. So this is an old map, obviously, of Falls Church, Virginia, which is where I live. And before we get to the modern day situation that my neighborhood faced, we need to understand some context. And so we're going to go back in time a little bit. So as I mentioned, I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. And after the Second World War, there was a small enclave of Black farmers who owned their own land right on the border between Arlington County and Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. This picture is a photograph of a home that was built by a former slave right after emancipation and was handed down in that man's family to his descendants. He was named Frederick Foote, and his descendants lived in that house for generations. This house is about a half a mile from the community that I'm going to tell you about today. And I looked for pictures of the houses in the community that I'm going to describe. And to my knowledge, there are no contemporary photographs of that neighborhood or the families that we're going to talk about. But this house is about a half a mile away and very much like the neighborhood that I'm going to tell you a story about. So by the 1950s, Fairfax County was growing very rapidly, and it needed a new high school. At the same time, school desegregation was becoming a very hot topic of discussion, and the civil rights movement was starting to gain traction. And to our shame, both of those things prompted a really significant backlash from the white power structure in the county. That backlash took multiple different forms, but for the purposes of our story today, the one that mattered is this. The county used eminent domain to take the land that belonged to 3 Black farmers, Charles and Carrie Hunter and Caswell Stallings. And it won't surprise you that when they took that land, they did not give them fair value for it. And on that land, they built a high school. The high school was built in 1959. And as part of the massive resistance against school integration and adding insult to injury, the school was named Jeb Stuart High School for a Confederate general. Since they were really careful not to displace any white families, the school was built on a very small or a relatively small plot of land. And it is actually the smallest footprint of any high school in Fairfax County. 60 years later, the school was renamed Justice High School for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who lived near this school until he died. But it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that Justice High School sits on the land that was more or less stolen from 3 Black farmers. 3 years after the school was built, in 1962, the Park Authority announced plans to develop Jeb Stuart Park, which is across the street from the school. It's now called Justice Park, but it was also named after the general when the park was created. And in 1962, the Park Authority pressured 3 Black families who lived there to sell their land. 2 of the landowners, a woman named Mamie Murray and a man named Roland Richard Denny, didn't want to relocate. And legal documents in the county show that Denny's land was taken by eminent domain, and he was paid a fraction of what the land was worth. No legal record seems to be still existing of how Mamie Murray's land was taken. At the same time, developers paid bribes to the County Board of Supervisors to rezone the land, changing it from farmland to urban residential land. As a result, taxes skyrocketed, and the remaining Black families in that area were forced to sell their land because they couldn't pay their taxes. The developers, of course, bought the land at a fraction of its value and built on it. And actually, 6 members of the Board of Supervisors were put on trial for taking bribes as part of this process, and 4 of them were convicted and went to jail. But no restitution was paid to the Black families who lost their land. And the developers built apartment buildings and houses on the land that they took. So what does all of that have to do with today? Well, as I mentioned, the high school, now called Justice High School, has the smallest footprint of any high school in the county. The school has one main building that was built in the late 1950s. Many of the big apartment buildings that were built in the area by those developers in the 50s and 60s and 70s now house lower income families. Many of those families speak Spanish. And actually, there are many Muslim families living in those high-rise apartments because we have a mosque that is close to the neighborhood. Many of the families who live in those high-rise apartment buildings, but not all, are recent immigrants, and their children attend the high school. As a result, the school has become overcrowded, and it has significantly more students than it was designed for. It also needs new science facilities because it was built in the 50s with classrooms and there weren't any labs built. So the school needs to renovate, and there was a bond that was approved by the taxpayers to update the school, including building a new, desperately needed classroom building with modern science labs. And they decided, since they don't have a lot of room at the school, that the new building should go right on the parking lot, which is going to cut in half the number of cars that can park on the school property. Now, the school is actually already short of parking. It needs additional parking. And they're having difficulty hiring teachers at this school. And part of the feedback from the teachers is that the teachers have to drive a long distance. They can't afford to live in the neighborhood where the school is located. And then when they get to the school, they can't find parking. There are a lot of cars that are parked in the neighborhood because the high-rise apartment buildings near the school also don't have enough parking. And so somebody decided, when they built on the parking lot at the school, the best solution would be to build a replacement parking lot on the land that is currently occupied by the park. Well, that creates another problem because the park is really extensively used by the children of the families who live in that nearby lower income housing and the high-rise apartment buildings. And the apartment buildings have no green space. In fact, this entire end of the county is low on green space. And the plan that was drawn up has a huge parking lot with big planters in between the parking spaces to put trees that are going to help cast shade and keep the cars that are parked in the parking lot cool. But to build the parking lot, they were going to eliminate 2 basketball courts, 4 tennis courts, and big lawns that are widely used by the community for picnics and cookouts. And in addition, several beautiful old growth trees were going to be cut down. Now, in Fairfax County, the County Board of Supervisors is extremely powerful, and it controls the funding for most activities in the county, including the budget for the school board and the budget for the park authority. In Fairfax County, pretty much everybody does what the Board of Supervisors tells them to do. And by the time the neighborhood found out about this plan to build a parking lot on half of Justice Park, The plans had already been drawn up, the Board of Supervisors had blessed them, and it seemed like the decision was irreversible. So what did we do? We organized. There was a group of neighbors who were extremely concerned about this plan. And although they had a shared concern, they came to this issue from a number of different places and priorities and perspectives. So the group of neighbors that formed the committee to organize an advocacy plan and an advocacy campaign was a combination of people who were concerned about the ability of local children living in the high-rise apartments to go outside and play. There were also people who were concerned about the environment and having adequate green space on our end of the county. And there were people who were concerned about the history of racial injustice in the community, which made building over spaces where Black and brown children play especially offensive. So they got together and they made an advocacy plan, like the one that we walked through. So they created a core leadership group, which in this case was 5 people who were all retired, and they had the time and the passion to work on this. They didn't do all the work themselves. They had lots of worker bees, but they were the strategists, and they also drove the campaign. And I want to be really clear, I was one of the worker bees, but I was not on the core leadership group in this effort. They did a lot of research, and they found a constellation of decision makers. The Park Authority Board was the lead agency responsible for deciding what would happen in the bounds of the park. But obviously the school board, which felt that they needed parking in order to attract high quality teachers to this school, had a role in this. And then, as I said, the real decision makers in the county on everything are the County Board of Supervisors. Next, the neighbors started looking for local organizations that would care about an issue like this. And there were 2 in particular that became really important partners in this effort. So Tinner Hill is a nearby community. It's not right in our neighborhood. It's about 2 miles away. And it was also a community of Black homeowners that got zoned and eminent domained out of their neighborhood. And Tinner Hill has actually for more than a decade had an organization called the Tinner Hill Heritage Foundation that has done a lot of research about the history of African American families who owned land in this part of the county after the Second World War. So we reached out to the Tinner Hill Heritage Foundation, and they had a paid executive director who was extremely knowledgeable about these issues, had a listserv that he could share information with, and also assisted with research about the origins of the park. The other organization that was extremely helpful in this effort was the Fairfax County NAACP. And they organized events, and they also sent information out to their mailing list. So I would like to pause for just a moment and ask you to put in the chat, if something like this were happening in your community, what are the groups that you might reach out to as potential partners? Who and what organizations in the neighborhoods where you live might you have recruited to help in an effort like this? So I see neighborhood associations, absolutely, and we organized those. The Parks Commission, certainly we needed to engage them. A historical society, great. youth organizations, especially since it's involving students at the school, nonprofits that focus on open space, the school district, parents with children affected, family resource centers. I love all of these ideas. Keep them going. There are so many assets in our community that we can bring to a campaign like this. And I love that you are really aware of the assets that would be in your community. So another thing that the steering committee did was they developed a slogan. And actually, if we go back one slide, the slogan was Justice for Justice Park. And that's kind of, it's catchy, it's memorable, it's short, and it's simple, but it really conveyed the heart of the issue that folks were concerned about. And Justice for Justice Park became the theme around which the campaign was built, and all of the information that we developed was provided. Everything that was done in English and in Spanish. Every event had a Spanish translator, and then many also had local community members who translated into Arabic for local Arabic-speaking families. And you can see this yard sign has Justice for Justice Park in Spanish on this side of the sign. And then on the other side of the sign, it had the same information in English. So another thing that we did was use social media to get the word out. And my 19-year-old daughter would tell you with an eye roll, "Oh, Mom, only old people look at Facebook." But since a lot of the people in the community that we wanted to educate are old, we started with a Facebook page. And again, you can see Justice for Justice Park was the theme and the big banner on our Facebook page. The purpose of the Facebook page was to educate the neighborhood and keep them informed about new developments. So again, a question for you. What social media are most effective for sharing information in your community? I love that Kelly said that her kids cringe when when you post on Facebook, and my kids right there with you. But what social media is useful and is paid attention to in your community? So Denise says Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Nextdoor. Great. WhatsApp, Nextdoor Neighbor, LinkedIn for Professionals. And the great thing about supermarket announcements, sometimes going kind of old school and low tech is highly effective. And, we've got a big bulletin board in our library where you can post information, newsletters, a lot of groups on Facebook that talk about a lot of different topics. GroupMe, that's a good one too. So one of the advantages of social media is it's free, right? Doesn't cost a lot. Another social media approach that we used was change.org. And on the next slide, there is a picture of our change.org petition called Justice for Justice Park. And one of the advantages of using change.org is when you set up your petition, you can set it up so that anytime somebody signs, a message is sent to a certain number of elected officials that you choose, and you provide the email address. But when somebody signs, then elected officials get a notification that somebody else has signed the petition, in this case, asking for the park to be preserved. And so that is a great sort of double impact. People in the community can show their support in a way that others in the community can see. It builds community, but it's also notifying decision makers, elected officials, about the support that you have in your community for the issue. And again, with change.org, you can choose which elected officials are notified by signatures and provide the contact information for them. When we created the change.org petition, we also created a QR code. And the next slide repeats this sign that I shared before, but I want to draw your attention to the QR code on the sign. And so in our neighborhood, we have a lot of folks who walk. Maybe they walk dogs, maybe they walk young children to the bus stop, maybe they walk children to school. And so they could take a quick snap of the QR code and get a link to the change.org petition to sign it. So by going to the change.org petition using the QR code, they could get additional information about the issue. And if they wanted to put their name on the petition, they had that opportunity. So Stephanie added in the chat that QR codes are very helpful for providing links to information. Absolutely. And we tried to take advantage of every system, every social media approach that we could to get the word out and to collect support for what we were doing. Now, some of these options that I'm talking about are free, and some are low cost but do require money. So we had to take up a collection. So, like printing those signs, we got 500 signs and it cost about $500. So it wasn't a huge cost, but it was more than any one family really wanted to spend. So, a question for you. If this were happening in your community and you needed a little bit of budget, not a huge amount of money, but still some money to invest in your advocacy campaign, who might contribute money? Where would you go to try to do a little modest fundraising so that your campaign would have some options for printing information to hand out? Maybe it's flyers, maybe it's yard signs like we did. So Vilma says businesses, and sometimes there are businesses that are affected or they want to be supportive of community initiatives. Churches, absolutely. Thank you, Sherry. Who else might you go to? Community leaders, businesses, coalitions that care about the issue? Absolutely. So in our case, terrific, Stephanie, the Chamber of Commerce, schools, partnership agencies, in our case, the school was on the other side of this issue. So Gwendolyn, you're right. In certain cases, schools might contribute. In our case, the school was on the other side. So one of the organizations that provided a little bit of money for this was the Tinner Hill Heritage Foundation, and another was the NAACP. So this picture on this slide shows you the African American man who is the executive director of the Tinner Hill Foundation and who helped us a lot with our research. Standing to his left is the Spanish language translator who came to a lot of our events and translated for the Spanish speaking families who were among those most impacted by the proposal to take away the park. We also pitched our story to media. So the steering committee reached out to the local paper. Now, this is a little complicated in the area that I live in because our local hometown newspaper is the Washington Post. And as you can imagine, it's kind of hard to get articles into the Washington Post. And they told us that they did not have a reporter to send out to cover our issue. However, we have a local paper that's called Annandale Today, and it is mostly online. And the Annandale Today wrote multiple articles about our issue. And one of the great things about local papers, even if they're small, and even if they're only published online, the local elected officials pay close attention to what those smaller local news outlets are talking about. And so this article, which was published in Annandale Today, started to get the attention of our local elected officials, including the County Board of Supervisors. Now, another strategy that our community used was a FOIA. So we discovered that the county had not followed its own rules for posting public notice, and that there were a set of procedures that the park authority was supposed to follow before you could take park land and convert it to another use. And the park authority and the county had not followed its own rules.
No, no.
Somebody needs to mute. So we discovered that problem through a FOIA notice by sending a message and or sending a FOIA request, a formal request, and asking the county to share with us all of the documents related to decision making about the park. When we discovered that the county had not followed its own rules, that was a blockbuster discovery. The Annandale Today newspaper wrote an article about that discovery and tweeted out on their own Twitter site articles and the photo that you can see. So this is a screenshot of one of the tweets that Annandale Today put out, and you can see our sign with the QR code is in the picture. So the result of all of this was that the tweeting of articles by the local newspaper meant that the campaign could share those tweets and amplify the message, but now the paper's own social media was complementing and extending the social media efforts by the campaign. And that was really exciting. The steering committee also organized community events to get people over to see the park who might not have spent time in the park before. They scheduled events, and this is a picture of an event. You can see it was during COVID, so lots of people are still wearing masks, even though they're outside. And this is a photograph of Mark Donert, who was one of the core leadership group. And he assembled this folding chart with maps and information about the history of the park. In this picture, he's got his setup at an event that was specifically organized by the campaign and was talking about the use of the park. But he also brought this setup to a number of other events. So, for example, on election day in November, the school is the polling place for everybody who lives in the community. And so he set up this table with flyers and information and his poster board outside the door where people needed to come and vote. And then he would stop them as they were going in or coming out and ask them if they knew about what was proposed for the park, and got a lot of people to stop and talk. Now, those folks might not have come to an event that was about the park, but because they were there, they were willing to learn more about the park. So it was important to both hold events that were specifically about our issue, as well as piggyback on other events to get the word out. So, as you can imagine, this was all a lot of work. What happened next? Well, having done all of this research, having learned all of the issues, the campaign advocates met with all of the decision makers. They met with the park authority. They met with the members of the school board, and they also met with members of the board of supervisors. And sometimes they met with those folks more than once. A few were on the side of the campaign, but most were not. Most of them really bought into the arguments about why the school needed the park in order to build parking. One of the interesting things, some of the folks who were on the other side, who did not agree with the arguments being put forward by the campaign, declined to meet. They wouldn't even talk to the community members who wanted to save the park. Again, that's when social media and the contacts with the press can be really helpful, because when advocates made it public that certain decision makers wouldn't even take a meeting, those decision makers were shamed into scheduling a conversation. In addition, it turned out to be really important that the campaign discovered that the park authority had not followed its own rules. And as a result, the advocates forced the park authority to hold the public hearings that were required by the rules. And they organized testimonials at the hearings. They organized students from the high school who acknowledged the need for parking, but also talked about why the park had been so important to them as a place where they could go and run and shout as they were growing up, and they didn't have space to do that in the apartment buildings. But it wasn't just the families who were affected. Certainly the families who were affected came and spoke, and that was vitally important for them to have a voice. But people from all over the community talked about the impact on children, the need for preservation of the environment and green space, and also talked about not perpetuating the racial injustice that was at the root of the park's original creation. And a really important element of all of this, as part of the testimony, advocates proposed alternative solutions that could increase parking without taking half of the park. The need for parking at the school was a very real need, and it had an impact on the school's ability to attract high-quality teachers. Nobody wanted to get in the way of bringing high-quality teachers to the school. Everybody acknowledged that that was important, just like everybody acknowledged that the school needed a new building and needed new labs. But there were alternative solutions, including taking a much smaller piece of the parkland that goes along the road and creating angled parking spaces on both sides of the road so that it could fit more cars, but have a much, much reduced impact on the park. So all of this took months. And it took a huge amount of time and effort on the part of the steering committee and on the part of the worker bees who volunteered. And some of those worker bees had a lot of time to volunteer, and some of them contributed in much more modest ways. But in the end, the community succeeded in either embarrassing the park authority into doing its job, preserving parkland, or maybe the result was that the park authority members were persuaded that with the community so strongly behind the mission of the park authority, the members of the park authority board could stand up to the county board of supervisors. And after months of work, what was the result? The decision was reversed and the park was preserved. So I hope that walking through my neighborhood's campaign to save Justice Park has been helpful to you in thinking through how to organize an effective advocacy campaign. And I know that we have shown this next slide before, but I always think it is worth saying again and reminding ourselves that Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." I also hope that this series of webinars, these 3 episodes, have been helpful to you in thinking about the issues that you care about and how you can effect change in your own community. So we have just a couple of minutes left in our time together today. If anybody has questions about what we did in our neighborhood and why, or maybe suggestions for things that we could have done that we didn't think about, please put them in the chat. We appreciate your sharing your ideas, and if you have questions, I will try to answer them. In the meantime, if you need to go on to the next thing that is on your schedule for your busy day, thank you so much for joining us for this series on advocacy. I really hope that it helps you take your passion and make the world a better place.